Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap with me, Philip Ingram. Now, I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer, global commentator on all matters defence, cyber, terrorism, security, or anything else that people ask me to. But I also, for my sins, present Times Radio Frontline. So I haven't presented many this week because I was away for a couple of days, but we've got some fantastic interviews for you to watch. And a few clips that are setting the scene. The first clip is, as ever, on Air Force One, and it's Donald Trump talking about the talks between Ukraine and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Have a look at this here.
Can you give us an update on what took place in South Florida today, those talks between the U.S. and the Ukrainians?
Well, they're going along, and they're going along well. We want to stop people from being killed. It doesn't have much to do with us. But I'd like to see if we could save a lot of souls. A lot of people are being killed. Last month, we had 27,000 people killed in that ridiculous war that should have never happened. It would have never happened if I were president.
Have you spoken with Rubio and Witkoff since
I have,
meeting?
yeah. I've spoken to them, and they're doing well. Ukraine's got some difficult little problems. They have some difficult problems. But I think Russia would like to see it end, and I know Ukraine would like to see it end.
You just said that Ukraine has a little bit of problems.
Well, we have a corruption situation going on, which is not helpful.
And is that impeding the peace talks?
Well, I said it was going on for 3 years, right? Didn't I say it? For 3 years I said it, so I was way ahead of schedule. But I think that there's a good chance we can make a deal. Yes, ma'am.
Exactly is Steve Witkoff going to Moscow, and do you want to extend Putin some sort of deadline?
Well, what is the second part of your question?
Do you want to tell Putin, here is my deadline for you to...
No, I don't have a deadline. I have a deadline when the war is over. And hopefully the war is going to be over. 27,000 people killed last week. 27,000 over the last 3 or 4 weeks. 27,000 people killed. That war should end.
Can you tell us what day Witkoff is going to meet with Putin? And then on that, is that meeting...
Sometime next week.
Okay, you don't have it. Is it early next week, late next week? Okay,
Sometime next week.
And this is Donald Trump saying that the talks are going well. And it's interesting that he seems to have reined back from the 28-point plan that Steve Witkoff had brought back from Moscow, where he then was coming out with the same language we saw in the ambush of Zelensky in the Oval Office, saying Ukraine should never start a war that it couldn't win, and that almost blaming Zelensky. He seems to have reined back from that, which is good. It shows Rubio has got some control over what Witkoff had pushed through, and this is after Rubio's discussions with European leaders and Ukraine in Geneva, and now talks in Florida. So the fact that Trump is saying they're going well is good, because whenever Witkoff takes the final plan to Moscow and it gets rejected, then hopefully Trump will remember that it's gone well, and he said that. The next video, by way of introduction as to what's been going on over the past few days, is another audacious attack by the Ukrainians, where they hit some Russian Shadow Fleet ships with sea drones. Have a look at this here. And in this footage, we can see the sea drones spotting the ship and going into the side of it, a large explosion but midships, and lots of fire and flames. And clearly there were other sea drones out there watching and filming this as the suicide drones went in and caused, I believe, 2 Russian Shadow Fleet ships to sink. Interestingly, some of the ship's owners, and Turkey in particular, have come out and asked Ukraine not to continue to attack Shadow Fleet ships. But Turkey is one of the countries that takes Russian oil for refining. I think ship owners are now very wary of sending ships into the Russian ports in the Black Sea Fleet, and certainly watching the marine surveillance platforms. There have been ships that were due to go in that haven't gone in and docked. I think they're scared about Ukrainian actions. Of course, this is Ukrainian SBU, their counterintelligence capabilities, their security services, and they work relatively closely with the HUR or GUR, their military intelligence, in carrying out audacious attacks. And this is yet another one that comes into the bracket of audacious attacks like Operation Spider's Web a few months ago. So I've got 3 interviews I want to point you at this week. The first one is with Jimmy Rushton, foreign policy and security analyst, and he's talking about divides in the Kremlin over the peace deal. Have a look at this here.
It's not going to be acceptable to Putin. But then again, I don't actually think the 28-point plan would be acceptable to Putin. Here's the thing. Like every government, the Russian government has competing factions. You have people that are trying to work towards Putin, to borrow a phrase from Nazi Germany, working towards the Führer. And then you have these competing factions like Kirill Dmitriev hates Lavrov. Lavrov is the foreign minister in Russia. They hate each other. You have Kirill Dmitriev, who's almost like Witkoff's opposite number. He's running a parallel foreign policy, and obviously that's stepping on Lavrov's toes, and Lavrov does not like this. And you can see in the language that the Kremlin used to talk about this 28-point plan, that they probably wouldn't be on board with all of it, because again, you have to look at what Russia has done in regards to their constitutional amendments, right? They've put Zaporizhzhia and Kherson into the Russian constitution as Russian oblasts, Russian regions. So if they accepted this, 28-point plan, it would mean that they have to essentially give up territory that they believe is Russian. Obviously, it's not Russian, but they believe it is. And you've seen criticisms from some of the ultra-nationalists in Russia of this plan, because they've said, hey, look, we're not going to give up Russian cities. These are Russian cities now. If we give them up, they're going to be, that's a betrayal. So I don't think that the Kremlin would actually agree to this. I think what they're trying to do, at least you obviously have Dmitriev freelancing, and then you have the Russians using this as a helpful tool to, drive a wedge between Ukraine, America, and Europe, and also create internal discord inside Ukraine itself.
No, it's interesting. That mirrors some comments that I got out of a Russian academic I was talking to in Moscow over the weekend, and he said the plan might not be completely acceptable and everything else. But do you think the fact that Dmitriev has put this forward is an indication that Putin is really worried about what's going on in the front line? He's looking for some out that there is, and actually it's an indication, more of an indication that Russia is losing and not winning.
I definitely wouldn't say Russia is losing. You have to look at the dynamics on the battlefield, and what is currently happening is Russia is advancing. They're advancing slowly, but they're still advancing. What I would say is that whilst Russia can, at the moment they're comfortable, they can continue this kind of tempo of operations for maybe 2 years, or 1 year to 2 years. That being said, the Russian economy is not looking great. The sanctions that the Americans have imposed on Russia have been effective. Reuters actually just published a piece in the last couple of hours, which said that by their analysis, Russian oil and gas revenues will drop by 35% in November, which is astonishing. I mean, it's a huge drop. So Russia is under severe pressure. I think that the problem that Putin has is once you've ramped up a war economy, it's actually quite difficult to go back to peacetime, because you have a lot of factories which are producing munitions, and suddenly you're not expending them. You have a lot of soldiers which are on the front lines, which then you have to bring back to civilian life. And what do you do with those soldiers? Do you give them jobs in the factories that are producing munitions that you can't use anymore? And nobody really wants to buy Russian weapons now. Weapons were a key export for Russia. But at this point, nobody really wants to buy them anymore. People are going to buy Western weapons or Chinese weapons, or weapons from other countries. So it's difficult for him. I think he would be very vulnerable if the war ended soon. He'd have to try and explain to the Russian people why, they've expended this huge amount of blood and treasure to gain devastated territories in Ukraine. Because I've been to some of the areas that Russia has occupied, and I've seen what's happened to them. And they're completely destroyed, like villages, towns, cities, where every building is destroyed. Everything is leveled. All the industry is gone. All the farmland is gone. It's covered by mines. It's covered by unexploded shells. It will never be economically productive in Putin's lifetime. So he's essentially traded, Russia's economic prosperity, because Russia was relatively rich, by Russian terms before this. It was selling a lot of oil and gas. It was making a lot of money. Gazprom was making an absolute fortune selling gas to Europe. and that's all gone. So yeah, he has to try and justify this to the Russian people. Dictators are not as susceptible to public opinion as democracies are, but Russia spends a lot of time and effort, focused on internally facing propaganda, and they do that because they are still worried about the opinions of the Russian people, even though that they can't vote. They're still worried about what Russian people think.
Now, in this, your Jimmy's going into Russia trying to work out what it wants to get, but explaining the fact that they don't seem to know what it is that they want, because they have been offered a lot of what they've been asked for and rejected it in the past, or haven't accepted the peace deals and always tried to get this a little bit more. And Jimmy explains quite eloquently that the Kremlin doesn't really know what it wants. It's sort of fishing for further divides, and possibly is carrying out tactics to see what divides there are in the international community, so then Russia can go and do things to try and make those divides even worse. And it's quite clear that they're playing with Trump. But Jimmy clearly says there's a recognition that Russia can't fight forever, but they need to sit down and work out really what it is that they want. Is anything going to come from the current peace deal? No, I don't think so at all. The next interview is with John Luff, who's a geopolitical expert at Chatham House, and he's talking about US reaction to the deal. Have a look at his interview here.
There is a school of thought that the Russians were happy for this peace plan to be leaked, and it does seem that Kirill Dmitriev, if you like, the sort of commercial negotiator, he's Witkoff's counterpart, that he was the one who leaked the draft, that they did this, in fact, to try to whip up anxiety in Ukraine and an expectation that the Ukrainians were about to be sold down the river by the US. And I mean, that hasn't, of course, had so far the desired effect. It has made people, of course, extremely anxious, and not just in Kiev, because in European capital as well, nerves are jangling, because it's just not clear what the Americans are expecting to get out of this, and whether sort of struggle within the administration might end up with, let's say, I would describe them, the sort of more realistic people like Marco Rubio will be able to restore some balance and say, look, we're actually going to damage long-term US national security interests if we simply abandon Ukraine and force Ukraine into an unequal deal. So there may still be some space, but I think we also have to accept the fact that President Trump at some point needs to get back to domestic issues in the US. Those election results in New York and Virginia showed that we can see that in the opinion polls, he's not doing so well. And there are people in the MAGA movement who's saying to him, why are you spending so much time on foreign affairs? So he may have a limited room for maneuver here. But I do think it's also worth considering for a moment the sort of Putin side of the equation, because it's just easy to think that he can carry on for another 6 months and just roll over the Ukrainians. Well, I'm sure he thinks that, and he would like to do that. But there is also, I think, in Russia, some increasing questioning about the purpose of this war, what it's ultimately going to yield, and the idea, let's say, that the Russians get the whole of Donbass. What on earth are they going to do with it? This territory that had been significantly depopulated, the Russians have destroyed much of it. This is what they call in Russian, as a nice phrase, it's a suitcase without a handle. This is an enormous burden for them.
Because there's also the school of thought that the leaking of this document, this 28-point plan, was also perhaps an attempt to see if the Donbass could be ceded to Russia without them having to fight for it, because the price to fight for it, well, it would just take too long, and it would be impossible for it to do it with any expediency.
Well, possibly. Of course, it's much more convenient if you can use diplomacy as a means to achieve your goals, rather than to have to fight. I mean, let's face it. I think Putin and those around him are absolutely indifferent to the loss of human life, and the fact that there may be upwards of 250,000 Russian soldiers killed in this war so far, up to anything like, I don't know, 800,000 to 1 million people severely injured. I don't think they care about that at all. But there is still the economic pressure. But I think more broadly, both within the elites and in society, the questioning about why are we doing this? What are we getting out of it? How does this actually help us? And is it really ever going to redound to Russia's credit that we entered into this war, and simply by force of arms took away territory from a neighboring country which we considered previously to be very friendly towards us? So there are huge questions there, and quite apart from the fact that the relationship with Europe, let's say at the very least, has been so severely damaged, and that's of course reflected in the fact that Russia's not supplying any pipeline gas to Europe as it did for 50 years. The fact that Russia is now much more dependent on China than it was before the start of the war. Russia would not be fighting this war if it were not for Chinese support and the readiness of China, to buy Russian crude oil, to supply it with very important dual-use goods that have kept industry functioning at a certain level. So there are, of course, many, many questions about this. So I don't think we should underestimate the fact that Putin may find himself in a bit of a quandary here, or just nervous about how long it will take, in fact, to, let's say, conquer more of Donbass or to force Ukraine into a surrender, because everything so far suggests this all takes much longer than the Russians would ever have believed.
And John starts to ask the question as to whether Donald Trump is too busy with other national issues. There's so much going on. We're coming into 2026 soon. He's got his midterm elections. He's focusing on what's going on in the economy. Donald Trump's popularity is not where it should be. And of course, militarily, he's still focused on what is happening with China. He's still looking Southeast Asia, and he's building up capability around Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and actions to try and overthrow Venezuela. So Trump is focusing on lots of different things around the place. And we haven't heard anything from his plan for the Middle East and rebuilding of Gaza. So he's got a lot of other things that he's working on. But again, what John brings out is the dynamics that are going on in Trump's immediate advisors, and in particular between Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Steve Witkoff, his special advisor to the Middle East and advisor into dealing with Vladimir Putin. Of course, Witkoff is such an experienced diplomat, being a real estate agent and Donald Trump's golf partner. That shouldn't worry us. But it's quite clear from the body language in the interviews that you see with those two individuals that Rubio and Witkoff do not see eye to eye. Rubio being the grown-up in the audience, Witkoff being so far out of his depth, you can almost hear him drowning. It's scary at times. But John's interview is fantastic and goes into this in much more detail. And final clip this week is for an interview with Yuri Sak, who's a former advisor to the Minister of Defense of Ukraine. And he's talking about the European version of the peace deal and how it can only really work if Trump renews the pressure on Moscow to halt the war. Trump is very quick at coming out with statements pressurizing Ukraine to halt the war, but he hasn't really come out with statements to pressurize Moscow to halt the war. And actually, if you look at where we've got to with this European version of the plan, the 19-point plan that has been distilled out of Russia's 28-point plan, the 28-point plan has no change in what Russia has put out time and time and time again. They haven't given one iota of ground in their demands, whereas the 19-point plan is giving a lot of ground from a Ukrainian perspective and a European perspective, and will be quite mature. Do I think Russia will accept it? No. Does Yuri think Russia will accept it? No. So therefore, don't just watch this clip, go and watch the full video.
When Donald Trump was inaugurated, he openly told the world about his strategy for solving this Russian war against Ukraine. And he said that, well, he will speak to Russia and he will speak to Ukraine. If Russians are not flexible, if they don't agree, he will exert pressure on the Russians. If Ukrainians are stubborn and don't want to be flexible enough to achieve some realistic agreement, then he will exert pressure on Ukraine. So this means that the United States of America continues to have the leverage. And the fact that Russians think that it's important for them to speak to Steve Witkoff, and the fact that Russians respond very nervously every time Donald Trump makes a statement that Russia is a paper tiger or that he's considering giving Ukraine Tomahawk missiles, all of this indicates that Russia is very well aware of the leverage that the US has. And from our perspective, this peace agreement, this peace process will work only if Donald Trump goes back to his original formula, which is peace through force. And when Ukraine and the United States of America and the European partners, when we all agree that this, for example, formula, this version of peace agreement is realistic, and that everybody should agree to it. And Ukraine has shown that we will never be an obstacle to peace process. There are certain red lines, but we have already moved the goalpost. We have already been flexible enough. Then the United States of America will probably, and Donald Trump personally, will be facing not a dilemma, but a choice, whether he exerts more pressure on Russia, and that results in Russia's being more willing to sit down at the negotiating table, or he abandons the process. Now, we hope that it will be the former, because Russian economy is in a very poor state at the moment, and it's not going to get any better. And, if the US, together with the European partners, if they pressurize Russia more, and we will continue as well with our deep strikes, which degrade Russian war machinery, Russian oil economy, and Russian ammunition depots and weapons facilities, all of this may bring Russia to the negotiating table, whether they want it or not.
So are you saying then that the best case scenario right now for Kyiv is that Donald Trump walks away so that you can continue taking the fight and defending your country, putting the pressure on Russia, upping the ante, upping the sanctions, so that then Russia can be forced to negotiate? Is that your point?
Well, the point I'm making is that we understand very well that this war will end only when Russia is no longer capable of continuing this war. Now, that means that Russia has to run out of resources. They have millions of people, and they have no regard for human life. So, people and manpower will never be Russian problem. But the money that they need to fund their war effort could dry up. And this is where we should be looking at. We should agree between ourselves, between the Ukraine and our partners, that this is the formula that is workable, sensible and reasonable, and it will ensure lasting peace, and it will guarantee that Russia doesn't reinvade Ukraine at some point in the future. And then we need to force Russia to sit down and sign it.
And of course, with all of the interviews that we've done this week, I pointed you at 3. There's lots more. Please go and watch all of them, because they're fantastic and will give you real long-form insights as to what is going on. And the subtleties of what's happening are really quite important. You can't get it from headlines. You can't really get it from the clips that I'm showing you here. So please go and watch the full videos. And of course, you can get early access to the full videos if you sign up for Times Radio membership. And that will allow you to put your comments and questions that I'll answer in our Q&A. And of course, you can get this, and you can get all of Frontline on your favorite podcast outlet. Just search for Times Radio Frontline. But thank you for watching. Goodbye.